Dorthea Dix was born April 4th, 1802 in Hampton, Maine, and she was involved in charity work from a young age, and while teaching a Sunday school class at a local house of correction, she discovered insane persons confined in horrible conditions. And through this teaching, Dix discovered her passion for wanting to reform and help the mentally ill. Her drive, along with her harsh childhood living conditions, shaped her early life and the work she would later continue in adulthood. Also, in 1824, she began to write a textbook called Conversations on Common Things, which was reprinted 60 times. And considering that the book was republished that many times before she began her prison reform, it shows Dix's impact beyond her private sphere of life. Through her work with prisons and mental facilities, Dorthea Dix paved the way for future mental institutions, creating fair conditions for the mentally ill. Dix's first few visits to prisons and mental facilities opened her eyes to the horrors of the prison system, inspiring her to begin her crusade for the fair treatment of the mentally ill. On March 28, 1841, Dix visited her first prison, which was the East Cambridge prison, to fill in for her friend who taught Sunday school there. In this prison, mentally ill women were also kept in the same quarters with male prisoners, and Dix's commentary on this practice was, "I come as the advocate of helpless, forgotten, insane, and idiotic men and women, of beings sunk to a condition from which the most unconcerned would start with real horror, of beings wretched in our prisons and more wretched in our almshouses." She also discovered through these visits that the reason most of these people were prisoners in the first place was because they had a mental illness, and in another visit, she saw that these prisoners specifically were chained to the walls, given little or no clothing, and no heat. These initial visits made Dix aware to how bad these conditions were, and it led her to begin to take notice to the prejudices against the mentally ill in their rougher conditions specifically. She found tragedy in the end of her willful ignorance coming by these stark realizations, but these realizations also motivated Dix to want to change and reform these conditions because she, unlike those around her, felt that nobody should be treated in this way.
Dix's argument for reform in front of the Massachusetts legislature was the main turning point in her cause, turning her plans into action since now she had a group of influential men standing behind her. In 1843, Dorthea Dix presented her cause to the Massachusetts legislature, hoping to establish an asylum in Worcester. Her speech swayed the men into believing that the mentally ill should be kept separate from convicts, a practice that has never been enforced before in Massachusetts. In the beginning of her speech, she used appeals of ethos, pathos, and logos to help her steer the men to this cause. For example, in her famous line, "Gentlemen, I commit you to this sacred cause," she convinced the men into believing that her form was a God-given duty that must be acted upon. Devices at the beginning of her speech, such as this one, manipulated the legislator so that they already began to agree with her cause. As she continued, she began to focus less about the appeals and more about factual evidence, in particular, what was happening in the Massachusetts prisons. She proclaimed to them that one man in Bedford was enclosed in a cell for 17 years, following other similar cases. The practice of abusing the mentally ill was common in all but one of the prisons she talked about. They enforced these punishments, such as solitary confinement, being chained, forced to take drugs, and engagement. After horrifying the men with these punishments, she finally honed them back into her original cause by appealing to their emotions. She called them fathers, husbands, and brothers, forcing them to step off their political pedestal and look at the situation as common people do. This personal touch was one of the most important ones in her speech, since they were able to gain the perspective of common people, like Susanna Wellesley, a middle-class woman who saw the failure of prison systems firsthand. As the result, for the sake of humanity, as well as ethical rights, they finally came to the verdict that a mental institution should be open to house the mentally ill separate from convicts. The success of her speech not only gave Dix the support of very well-established men in Massachusetts, but also gave her the confidence to continue her fight with other states. However, the asylums that were created were not the final solution, as they also enforced some unethical treatment such as improper drug use. Yet the treatment they received here was significantly improved compared to the prisons. Even though this speech was only the first of many, it began a series of triumphs over the unfair treatment of the mentally ill.
As Dorthea Dix began to open up mental facilities across America, she started to leave her mark on a national level, which, in return, changed the basis of the treatment of the mentally ill permanently. Dix visited North Carolina in 1848, which was one of the only seaboard states that lacked any mental facilities, and this led to the opening of the Dorthea Dix Hospital in February 1856 on 182 acres, a mile from Raleigh. Examples of triumphs made because of the Dorthea Dix Hospital were the professionalization of nurses, the policies that started to differ between the less mentally ill patients and the more dangerous, and more humane forms of treatment, including the ending of the use of restraints and the advent use of effective pharmaceuticals to treat various mental illnesses. Her work also led to the removal of mentally ill patients from prisons and other inappropriate environments. Despite her personal battles with ill health, she spent many more years attempting to improve the lives of the mentally ill, and because of her efforts, she was able to open up 23 mental hospitals all on her own.
After the opening of her original 32 mental institutions in the United States, more and more towns and cities were inspired by her work and followed in her footsteps. By the end of her life, 126 facilities were opened in the U.S., and now, in 2018, there are over 12,000 institutions throughout the United States. Dorthea Dix's reforms were the main cause of this growth, since she took a stand against prisons when no one else did. Without her, this tragedy would most likely still be in the process of being fixed, resulting in the unfair treatment of the mentally ill. If this was true, and if she did not create these reforms, more people today would be less likely to seek help for their mental disabilities, since they would have to fear imprisonment and other unfair treatments. These factors combined prove just how successful Dorthea Dix was in triumphing over the tragedy of prison systems back in the 1830s. We would like to thank Mary Reinhardt for giving us the opportunity to interview some of the workers at the Massachusetts State House. This information guided us in our research, opening our eyes to new sources and various ideas. We would also like to thank the many researchers who published Dorthea Dix's speeches online. This gave us access to innumerable primary sources that we would otherwise not be able to find.